It's hard to say what you want somebody to remember about you. Everybody feels like they've failed in a lot of ways. How about it? I did the best I could. It would be nice if people thought I was a nice person. And that used to be true. But not, not everyone's nice all the time. I'd like them to think of me as a nice person. Giving. A giving person.
Where and when were you born?
Catherine with a C, Ellen Forbes, and I was born in Detroit at Crittenden Hospital, which previously had been a home for unwed mothers, but had been turned into a maternity hospital, and it was the first hospital my mother delivered a child in. She had the first two at home. I was born on November 5th, 1946. We lived at that time on Steele Avenue. I see it's called Steele Street now. And I think the house number was 13144 Steele in Detroit. Um, we lived in half of a house. I only lived there till I was 3, so I can't tell for sure if my memories are correct. But I think we lived on the first floor. And then the way the houses were built, there was a stairway that went up to the second floor where another family lived. And I think they owned it, and my parents rented, but I'm not absolutely sure. It certainly looked like our house when you saw the backyard and the garage. It looked like it was our things. Across the street was my best friend, Alan Freeborn, who lived with his parents. He was an only child. I actually saw him for the last time, I think, when I was in college, because I went to college in Detroit. My parents had 3 children. My brother was almost 18 when I was born, and my sister was almost 15. That was John Robert and Patricia Ann. And my brother had a girlfriend who then later he married, June Bellingall. And they were all excited about, his mom being pregnant. And I think my sister was quite unexcited about this happening because it was totally embarrassing to have your mother be pregnant when you were in high school. And I was probably babied a lot because it was like being an only child. Uh, my parents worked, and I'm not sure that my mother was working at the time, but my parents had worked for their whole lives at Western Union Telegraph Office. My father was an assistant operations manager. So my parents came from Canada as young people. My father did not want to stay on the farm, and my mother, I think, was looking for work. So many, many young Canadians came over to Detroit from Ontario to look for work. And they both worked in the same building, both worked at Western Union. I believe my mother was a telegraph operator. And they met on Halloween, and they were engaged on New Year's, and they got married on February the 29th. And I can't remember the year, 30 something. And my mother said they got married that fast because she didn't want to change her mind. She had had lots of boyfriends and always changed her mind about them, so she married him. And it worked out. They stayed married. I guess it worked out. They stayed married, let's put it that way. Um, my father came from a farming family in the Woodstock Embro area in Ontario. His father, and I guess his mother, their families had come from Scotland as many farmers in Scotland did, and I'm not exactly sure why they all immigrated, but um, there was a rather large group actually of Forbes in the Ontario area. I think a lot of them also went to Australia because when they have the reunions now, they seem to take place in Australia and in Canada. My father's mother's last name was Matheson, Matheson, and there's a large family history book that has been created. We call it the Red Book, that has information about her side of the family. My mother's family was quite different. Her father was William Edward Tully Barton, and he seemed to be a good-looking young man and lived in the Niagara Falls, Ontario area. My grandmother, probably her name was Mary Ellen Meach, met him in the Niagara Falls area. She had been living there, and I'm not sure what she had been doing, but they got married there. The story was that his mother wasn't in favor of this wedding. I'm not sure why, but his mother kept calling both my grandmother and their children by different first names because she didn't like much of anything that they did. My grandmother, Mary Ellen Meach Barton, had, and I didn't realize this until a couple of years ago, had been one of the children who lived in, I believe, Liverpool, but it was somewhere in England, who became what they called Barnardo's Orphans. There was an institution run by somebody named Barnardo, and they took in children who had no parents or their parents couldn't take care of them. It appears that my grandmother's parents got a divorce. Her mother had been born in Ireland. I'm not sure if her father had been, but they were living in England, got a divorce, and there were two girls. One was named Margaret Elizabeth, and the other one was Mary Ellen. Margaret was, I believe, older, and she went to live with an uncle in England. And my grandmother was among many children who were put on a boat without any parents or adults accompanying them, just the institution's people, and sent to either Canada or Australia to become pretty much workers. My grandmother was 13 at the time. Some of the children who went were very small and were probably more adopted into a family. But many of the other children were just seen as workers. I had no idea this happened and have never heard any stories about how her life was. She went to something called Welland District, which I believe is where Niagara Falls is. And so she must have been still living there when she met the person that she married. We heard many different stories about her father, who, according to my mother, was a sort of a fly-by-night. He had many different jobs. He kept changing jobs and moving them sort of all over Ontario. And he worked in mines. He sold things. He invented things. And he was an artist. And he truly was an artist. I have some pictures here that he did. He worked in oil for a long time, and he had this little, they call it folk art. He made like flowers with these tiny little strokes in them. And the oil work ruined his lungs so that he had to do watercolors at the end of his life. For a while, he ended up living in Arizona. At some point, my grandparents separated and never did get divorced. As far as I know, they were still married. As far as my grandmother knew, they were still married, but they were separated for many, many years, probably from the time she was maybe 50 until she died in her 80s. And she never saw him at that time. At the time they separated, I believe they lived in Ottawa. And I did visit their house once, or her house. It was a small house, and they had rented it out, and then they were selling it. She was a tiny person who had a funny accent, somewhere between Irish and English, and from American. So no one could actually tell where she was from. People called her Kitty when I was growing up. I don't know why, but she was a timid person, but she laughed a lot, and everybody seemed to like Grandma Barton. She lived with my parents, my mother, for a while and helped out, and then she lived with others of her children. So when I was born, my father was 45 and my mother was 40, and they were looking ahead to retirement. And they liked going up, especially my father and his brothers and his nephews. They liked going up to Grayling, Michigan, to hunt and sometimes to fish, but mostly to hunt deer. So they had always dreamed of having a place up north. And when I was 3, they bought a motel, tourist home, that was later called the Cedar Motel, I think, on US 27 in Grayling. And my father wanted to wait until he could retire from Western Union to actually move. So my mother and I, and some of the time my sister, moved up to Grayling when I was 3. By this time my brother was at U of M in Navy ROTC. And my sister was going to college. I believe she went when she was 16. To Alma College for a year and a half. And my father would go up every weekend from Detroit to Grayling on the old roads, and it took a long time. Sometimes he actually took the train. And my mother operated this business, and my sister helped sometimes, but really hated being home. She wanted to be at college. And so she ended up actually getting married relatively early to Marty Kitchen up there in Grayling. There are pictures of me being the flower girl for both my sister's wedding and then later for my brother's wedding. Or was it the other way around? Must have been the other way around. And I wasn't very old in either one of them. I hope you have the picture and can show that picture of them walking down the aisle and the attitude my mother had about that wedding. There's a frown on her face. But there are a lot of my other relatives in that picture. A cousin, actually a cousin by marriage, and some others. And I think she didn't think that Marty would be the right husband. He was a Grayling small town guy. As it turned out, he was an alcoholic. But as life went on and Pat and Marty had one child, Julie, and got a divorce, it turned out that everyone, including my mother, really loved Marty. He was a good guy. He was always there if you needed him. He was not always there if his wife and child needed him, but for most people, he'd do anything for you. And he used to come over and fix things for us and help out with, I remember he was working on a light in the kitchen. And this was long after they were divorced. And Pat liked him. They were just friends, even to the end. My brother and his wife. My brother got married to June when he graduated from U of M, ROTC. I think. Yes, I think it was after college. I could be wrong. They might have gotten married when he went to U of M. When he got out of U of M, and he was an officer in the Navy. He was stationed in California and went to the Korean War on, I believe it was an aircraft carrier called the Boxer. And it was his job, because he had majored in business, was a whatever they call a purchaser. He purchased products that had to be used on the boat. And communication wasn't very good at that time. It was hard to get news. But we were living in Grayling, and I remember my mother being terribly worried because there'd been a fire on the Boxer, and nobody knew who was hurt or what. And it turned out that my brother had had appendicitis while they were in port at Okinawa, and they left him there to have his appendix out. So he wasn't even on the ship when the fire happened. But it took days, maybe a week, to find that out, because telephones, long distance was expensive. You couldn't always get through. It's kind of like our computers now. They just didn't always work perfectly. And you had difficulty getting information, like who to call. When we lived in Grayling, and people ask, how did you spend your time? I was like an only child, with a mother who was working in the motel. Sometimes she hired help to clean rooms, and she rented the rooms in the tourist home, which was upstairs mostly in our house, to people who stayed for quite a while. They'd stay by the month, and I don't really remember any of the people, except I know that there were regulars who stayed there all the time, and I don't remember ever even having seen in those rooms, but we weren't there all that long. I have some pictures of my mother's family, a few pictures. It seemed to be more pictures of my mother's father than anyone else. I think he was considered to be a good-looking young man, and there's this very formal picture, which Chris is going to put up later. 1905, and he went by the name Tully Barton. There's another picture. He looks about the same. He was going off to the First World War, and they had a picture taken. My mother wrote their names. We have my mother, Viola, and they called her Billy. Her brother Leonard, and Alice, and Dorothy. There was one more child who was born after her father's return from the war in 1918. I have a copy of their marriage certificate in 1905, and at that point they thought my grandmother's name was Mary Meach, which I think is correct. There are a lot of documents that have her name as Margaret, and they have her birth date and birth year different. I also came across the passport with the passport photo in it that my grandmother finally got. It tells her birth date, February 4th, 1888. Her height 5 feet, her eyes gray, and her hair brown gray. Place of birth, Westow, Durham, England. We always celebrated her birthday on March the 3rd, and I believe that she thought her birth year was not 1888 either. Her baptism certificate and what she thought to be true were not the same, but it's understandable that she wouldn't know, since she came on a boat by herself, and probably whatever records the institution had were what she went by, and they may or may not have been correct. probably when I was, I don't know, 10, maybe even older. During one of my grandmother's trips from Canada to visit us and help us out in Michigan, my sister, Pat, was bringing Grandma across the Windsor border, and they were stopped and asked the questions, where were you born, where are you going, how long are you staying? And at that time, if you were Canadian and you were visiting the United States, they registered that fact, and I think you only had an X number of days before you had to go back, or months, or whatever. But they did have to have a record of it. Well, when they asked my grandmother, where were you born, she thought they said, where are you going? And she said Detroit. And my sister didn't want to correct her, so they drove through. And my grandmother stayed very long that time during her trip because everyone was afraid to have her go back and admit that she had sort of entered the country illegally. I forget who the president was at the time, but they did an amnesty for illegal aliens, which was good because by this time my grandmother was getting old enough to actually get Medicare. I don't know if it's still true, but at that time, she could get health insurance here, and I think she even got Social Security payments based on my parents' income. But she couldn't sign up because she was an illegal alien. So at that time, she got it all straightened out, and I think they called them registered aliens. My parents, my mother and my father, both became naturalized citizens in Detroit. They just had to take a test, live there, and have a job, and go through the legal process of becoming American citizens. The history in my father's family is much easier to trace because more people seem to have taken an interest in it and done some research. It seems that the Forbes family, especially, and the Mathesons were a proud bunch. Maybe all Scots are proud. As the years went on, the Canadians and the American side of the family used to have reunions and have baseball games that were quite serious, the Americans against the Canadians. And they also played hockey together. But that side of the family, if you look online, you can trace back quite a ways. Chris went to Scotland. My brother and my sister both went to Scotland. I think my brother went twice. And we're planning a trip in the fall. And it's pretty easy to go through Scotland and find things about your family. Find your tartan, find things related to your clan. My mother's family was always considered to be Irish in its background on my grandmother's side. And they were very, very poor. I came across something today that said that when my grandmother's father turned her over to Barnardo's, he was not able to produce a marriage license. They were divorced at the time, but the original marriage license between him and his wife, because at the time they were married in Ireland, he was too poor to pay for the certificate. Kind of makes you wonder if it was legal or not, since there was no record. But they appeared to be a married couple who then later got a legal divorce. They were poor. If you see some pictures, they really look like what people would have referred to as shanty Irish. There are pictures of some of the family standing outside a shanty in Canada with clothes on them that look like rags. It just looks like they really were poor. And they were not the only ones. They were having a tough time. And everybody went to London to try to find work, and that didn't work, which is why they ended up with so many lost children. Canada was populated and flourished because of this influx of children from England. There are books and research done on it, and it's pretty amazing. I can't go any farther back, I don't think, than my grandmother's parents, their names, and my grandfather's parents' names. Although they seem to be part of the neighborhood and to have standing in this neighborhood in the Niagara Falls area. My mother was born in Niagara Falls. But then the other children were born all over Ontario. I should add that on my grandmother's side, there are English people, and I don't know exactly how I'm related to them, who do have some research. And they're the ones who actually informed me about my grandmother's childhood. And then there's some relative in the West here, I believe it's Arizona, who had met my grandfather. And I'm not sure if I should repeat that story. Okay, so here we are feeling all sorry for my grandmother, who was sent over on a boat at age 15 and worked hard all her life. And according to my mother, her husband was unreliable. My mother said that her father had girlfriends in town, and that he actually had my mother run messages to them when she was in town, and that he didn't ever stay in one place very long, and he pretty much stopped long enough that there was another child on the way, and then he'd go off to mine in some next town or to do something. Well, this relative that I conversed with through email, a man who lives in the West here, tells me that he is related through these English people, I guess, to, no, I don't remember how he's related now. He might be related to my grandfather. That he had met my grandfather, that my grandfather had actually given him a picture that he'd done. There is a newspaper article that I have somewhere talking about my grandfather, the artist, the retired artist, who was somewhat disabled because of his lung condition from having worked with oil so long. And he appeared to be just a nice old artist. This gentleman told me that the story was that when my grandfather came back from the First World War, that yes, the next child, Bill, was born, but that Bill was not my grandfather's child. So he came back from the war and realized that the situation had changed and that they were not together anymore after that. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if the timing is correct. I know that I never heard that from my family, but it's amazing what I didn't hear. People didn't talk too much about it. I don't think my grandmother would have told those stories. Any of them. She didn't even criticize her husband. She talked about him once, said, I would take him back in a minute if he showed up. And she was 80 years old. And it was not understandable, but it was true. Well, she was a character. Okay, what was the next one? First, people remember things differently than they happened. And a child especially only sees a part of the picture that's going on around them. So their interpretation of the way things are is certainly not always accurate. And I swear the things that you remember the best about the far, far past are the bad things that happened to you. When I lived in Detroit, and many of these are just stories I've heard from family. I was fawned over because I was the baby and everyone else was grown up pretty much. And the neighborhoods then, and I know it's still true because, it was true later too. Um, there was a sidewalk. The houses were the old-fashioned houses that looked sort of like all in the family houses, and there was a sidewalk in front of them, and people took the bus downtown to work, and that's what my father did. And apparently, people walked by a lot on our street, and my mother put my playpen out in the morning and the afternoon so I could wave, and I was a baby, to the people as they went by. This Alan Freeborn, his parents were across the street, and they were friends of my parents. And they were quite religious. And later in life, oh yes, and Alan, I moved when we were 3. He became quite a violinist. When I graduated from high school in Grayling, I went to Wayne State University for 2 years and lived in Detroit. And at that time, I actually met up with him and we conversed about things. And he still was playing the violin and was, I believe he was going to University of Detroit. When we moved to Grayling, the first 3 years when we lived in the tourist home, to me seemed a blur and not all that much fun. When I look at my report cards, I realize that a lot of it was because I was sick. I had allergies, and that caused ear infections. And at that time, penicillin and sulfa were the only things they could use. They hesitated to use them because you might need them someday. But they didn't have antihistamines that worked. They didn't have anything else that could stop this process. And so I was sick a lot, and I missed about half of kindergarten and about half of first grade. I don't think I really started going to school regularly until I was in 3rd grade. So it was a bit of a blur. I do remember having earaches and waking up with both eardrums broken on the same night. But the house was a little bit scary. It was sprawling, and there was a basement that at least one of the rooms wasn't completely cemented. There was dirt in it. There were rats that came up behind our kitchen stove. That I remember. I remember my mother being afraid of the rats. My sister's boyfriend at the time, Marty, was a conservation officer. He brought a fawn, and we have pictures here of this fawn in the backyard. We were all playing with it. I think later they did let this fawn go. Down the street, about 3 or 4 houses, there was a Buick dealership, and I would go down there. If you turned that corner and go about a block and a half, it was the elementary school. When it came time to go to school, I was 4, and Billy Joseph lived down at the other corner, and we wanted to go to the same kindergarten class. It was morning or afternoon, so we had to go in the morning because Billy had to take an afternoon nap. I remember that he kept wanting me to stay overnight at his house, and neither one of us could understand why his mother and my mother didn't think that was a good idea. He had siblings, a couple of them. They moved out of the neighborhood. It was sort of a place people just lived for a while, I guess. Uh, I don't remember at that point ever going to a store, and we must have. I really don't. I remember my sister when she was home. She stayed in this one bedroom. My mother used to send me in to wake my sister up, which was not fun. You had to stand way back and sort of shout at her because she would swing her arm at whoever was trying to wake her up. It's amazing what you remember, and you probably don't remember anything that's real. We had really nothing to do. We must have gone to bed early because in the evening there really wouldn't be anything you could do except maybe read. There wasn't TV. There wasn't good radio reception. I know Chuck says they listened to the radio constantly. There were serials on the radio, and in the big city of Baltimore, they all listened to the radio all the time. Don't remember that. This was Grayling. We didn't have a TV until I was about, I don't know, 8, maybe 9. The only thing I remember is having a very large tricycle that I fell off and got 2 black eyes. I remember a sled, actual sleds we had with, the metal runners. Before too long, I wasn't very old. It must have been maybe 7, maybe even less. I started skiing. Everyone in town skied. And our parents just sort of, for $18.75, you could get a pass for the whole winter. Before we even bought the pass, you could ski for free if you wanted to walk up the hill and ski down. So you had to put your skis on, walk up the hill, and then ski down. And that took a lot of energy. We were all quite active. And skiing was a very big part of our recreation up there. We had a movie theater. It's still there. They just raised $100,000 to switch to digital because they were still using film, and the industry is shutting off that capability, and so they will stay open. The Rialto Theater, 900 Maple Street.
How old were you?
That was the second one. That was from the time I was 6 until I graduated from high school. I saw actually in 1953 on some paperwork. Especially, I remember my mother complaining at the first one and about the time of the first place that the town was closed to outsiders. And unless your family had lived there for several generations and were Danish, you were an outsider. And they used to talk about people and sort of gossip. It is true that there are certain names in that town and everybody's related to each other. But I never actually experienced feeling like an outsider because enough people had moved into town by the time I was aware of it. Especially since once we moved to the second one, and here's this sign that says Forbes Motel. One of my classmates, 2 of my classmates' parents also had motels, Marshall Motel and Houle, Houle, Woodland Motel. That one is still open. The Marshall Motel still sits there empty, as does the place we owned. It's empty. My mother sold it in the 70s and for $200,000, and it was for sale this year for $70,000 and still hasn't sold. So bad economy. Once we owned the businesses, believe it or not, we were considered upper class. Doesn't make any sense because we were not money, as far as money changing hands, we didn't have a lot of money, but it had prestige that other kids always thought we were richer. I don't know why. I always thought that in that small town that the people who were involved with the stores downtown and the bank, mostly they were, last name was Kraus and Aliff. They all, and Joseph, to me seemed like the ones that had more money, but there were no real rich people in town, not even the doctors. I wouldn't consider them rich. But somehow, as soon as you had this motel, you were considered smart and in the upper class. And my mother and father pretty much did all their work themselves, and as much as possible, washed the sheets in the basement. After I got like high school age, I would take things like towels to the laundromat. We did all of our work ourselves pretty much. So we weren't rich. And how would you know? I don't know. I mean, eventually in 1964, my mother bought a Buick. That was the first rich thing any of us did.
Do you guys ever go on vacation or anything you guys did regularly?
No, that's a sore subject for me because when you have a motel in a Western Union office, you can't go on vacation, ever. One person can, but not the other. And the worst time was when my parents told me we were going to Florida, and we got as far as Detroit, and they said they were going to Florida and they were leaving me with my aunt. I was so mad. As an adult, I finally made it to Florida. But what did we do? As I said, somebody always had to stay there and keep the place open. But the other person, we would take rides. It was a beautiful area. Harwick Pines, the lake, the river. My father fished. My father, especially once, well, when he was coming up on the weekends, my father, children liked my father. He was good to children. He would make us help in the basement with the tools, fixing things, help in the motel. He would take me out to his fishing spots, and sometimes we go fishing, but mostly we just go check and see if there were fish. He taught me to drive. He kept saying, in case he had a heart attack, I needed to know how to drive this car. And I wasn't very old, and I kept thinking he was going to have a heart attack at any moment. And there was one dirt road called Lipstick Boulevard, because he marked his way into the fishing spot on a telephone pole and with lipstick. So we would go out there. I think we were just looking to see if there were fish. I don't know how you can tell, except that one day at the opening of trout season, we went out in waders, and there were so many fish in that branch of the river, that they were jumping out of the water to get our worms. So I guess sometimes they stocked these places. We went to Forbes reunions, held in, I believe, Woodstock usually. They were organized mostly by the Canadians, and they had sports, like there was a softball game, horseshoes, three-legged race, potluck, and always a bagpiper. And it would be the Canadians and the Americans getting together on a weekend afternoon once a year. I went there. I don't believe I ever went with both my parents, but I went with my father a couple of times, and I believe we actually took our kids there once. I don't know if they remember. I think Heather remembers the bagpiper. I was between generations in my family. The Detroit family, all of my first cousins were way older than I was. My second cousins, or whatever you call it when they have children, were way younger than I was. And so I didn't really ever have cousins I spent time with socially much. There, besides the summer picnic in Canada, there was always a Christmas party in Detroit area. One of these cousins would host it. Actually, the parents did it, and then it came down to the next generation. And then they tried to bring it down to the next generation, but it died out, I think. I'm not sure because we were not always invited. They kept forgetting us. But when we did go, I was always impressed with this group of people. How smart they were, how well dressed they were, and they were fun. Unfortunately, several of them, many of them, had drinking problems. They may not have thought there were problems, but as they grew older, it made most of them sick. I don't think we want to say, well, I don't think we want to give away all family secrets, but we usually did have our family come up, my sister and brother, and their families for Christmas, Thanksgiving. Sometimes they stayed, like, I remember there was at least one where there was a Thanksgiving dinner and then they stayed until New Year's, through New Year's. So we always had turkey at Thanksgiving. New Year's was supposed to be prime rib and Easter was ham. And Thanksgiving was turkey. There was a year when everyone, my brother and his wife, my sister and I, went skiing Christmas Eve afternoon. My sister broke her leg and started yelling. This must have been a senior in high school, and my classmate, Mark Anderson, was one of the big ski patrol people. He drove what they called the ambulance. It was just a station wagon with my yelling sister in the back. I thought maybe all broken legs hurt that much. She yelled for 2 weeks, I swear. She got to the hospital and said, "No, I don't want anyone touching me," because she didn't recognize the doctors. They put a cast on her leg, and she continued to yell until they figured out that one of the 2 bones she broke was really not set right, and they had to do surgery. And at that point, she started to feel a little better, and she spent the whole winter in our living room in a hospital bed. And Julie, her daughter, started going to my school again, which was, you don't want your little niece tagging along to school. But that particular holiday, I do remember my father both of my parents drank in different ways. My father drank in the garage, in the kitchen. He would get up in the middle of the night and need a drink. He didn't act particularly different when he was drunk. He just got a little sleepier. But right after my sister broke her leg, it may have been Christmas Day, my father accidentally dropped the garage door on his head and he had to go to the emergency room and have this thing taken care of. I went to camp that year, winter camp, and managed to have a toboggan accident and need stitches in my eyebrow. And I kept calling home to find out how Pat was doing, and she was still yelling. So, I don't know. It was a strange year. And it was very unlucky. We really didn't want to repeat that one. That's
Good
all
guess.
anyone had, except the very strange people in the cities. Everyone had real trees. They didn't really sell that many artificial trees, and the artificial trees tended to be white or silver. They were not like they are now, looking like real trees. So yeah, we had real trees. I don't remember it being quite as commercial. I do, until I became a teenager, I don't really remember that many presents. I don't remember presents being a terribly important part of our lives. And I remember my sister being upset because she was poorer than my brother. And if they all spent Christmas under the same Christmas tree, my Lindsay, my brother's daughter, would have so many more presents than my sister's daughter. So they tried never to open their presents together. But we were not as, for the most part, interested in things. There weren't as many things to have. I got 50 cents a week allowance for quite a few years, and it never was spent. It went straight into the bank account. And when I had enough, $18.75, I would buy a savings bond. I would ask my parents for the money I needed to use. I never used my allowance. I worked in the motel and in the Western Union office from a very young age. And I had access to what we called the till. It was the money, the cash we kept. And if I wanted to go downtown and look around at the dime store, I would just reach in and take as much change as I thought I'd need and go. But like I said, there wasn't a lot of overspending because there was nothing to buy except penny candy or something.
So you got an allowance and then you just stole from your parents.
Yeah, I know, they knew. It was okay with them. I don't think they ever came to me and said there's a lot of money missing.
Besides being a thief, what were you like as a child?
That's perfect. I was a strange child. I was considered smart. It's amazing how you get tagged as something. It was a very small town. And I couldn't have been that smart because I wasn't either the valedictorian or salutatorian in my class. I was third. But,
Out of how many? Out of how many?
42. We had 42 in my class. From kindergarten through 12th grade, same class. There was only one class of us, and it stayed that way for quite a while. I think the class after us had 60, but it was a small school for a long time. After I'm at the age of 6, met the car dealer. What's his first name? Roy McKevers, his wife Gladys, and his family was the same. He had a daughter, Vicky, and her siblings were way older than she was. So she was like an only child. They lived out at the lake. He introduced me to Vicky, and I hung around with the McKevers. I went on their vacations with them. I did a lot of things with them. They were Baptists. This was an independent Baptist church that was a block from my house. I started going to the Baptist church, and I started going to Baptist camp for a week every summer. I became a very strict Baptist and went to church at least Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night, plus other activities. My mother was a bit mortified because this was way too religious. It was way more religious than she was. My sister said she had done the same thing as a youth, had sort of gravitated to a very strict, structured religion. And she and I both thought it was probably because we didn't have a lot of structure in our lives. We were less structured than other places, so you always even it out by finding your own rules. Fortunately, my rules would have made me carry my Bible, be very shy, Never, ever went to a high school dance. Weren't supposed to go to movies. We didn't, actually. Even if a movie came on TV, you weren't supposed to be watching movies on TV. No makeup. Until I got to be about 16 and said, I'm not sure that I understand why we have all these rules, and I just stopped going to that church.
And then what were you like after
I was
16?
still the same. I was pretty much still the same, but I was not wild, but I just, I had a friend then, Vicky's cousin, Pat. This was one of the families that was around, McKevers. There are a lot of McKevers up there. I dated several McKevers there. Okay. But Pat McKevers, she was wild, a little wild at the time, and now she's the strict one. She lives in Grand Rapids. We had some fun. We had more fun, but I still was a little backward because of my lack of. I still don't dance. Never did dance. And now they dance in Heather's church, so I don't know. I remember not understanding why my mother said no to a church trip, like down to Houghton Lake. We would go down to Houghton Lake to a roller skating rink, or we would go to a church event in another small town. The roads were bad. And she said, no, the roads are too bad. You cannot ride with someone down to that church. And those were the only kinds of disagreements we had where I was wrong and they were right. I graduated from high school when I was 17. And it was just a small town graduation kind of thing. I'm trying to remember. I think I was still being forced to work in the motel. I wanted to work someplace cool, like, Dawson's, which was the local Coke place, or a drive-in, or something more fun. But every time I said I wanted to get a job somewhere else, my mother paid me more to work in the motel. It didn't dawn on me that she was just keeping the money in the family, but I went to Wayne State University for 2 years. I actually thought that a friend of mine was going to be going too, but she ended up not going. So this was it was a mistake. It's in downtown Detroit, and it's a good college. And my parents thought that was a good idea because I'd be in Detroit, close to my sister who lived in Detroit, and my brother lived in the area too, in Farmington Hills, I guess at the time. And they seemed to think that would help, but I really didn't see my sister much once I was down there. And they had one dormitory for girls. It was mostly outstate girls who lived there. It is a commuter college, so all these people take one class at a time. They all excel in that one class at a time, and it's kind of tough on the people who are actually going full time. It's a very academic university. At the time, they hardly even had a football team, and we, as a dormitory, got to know each other pretty well. We had to walk about a block and a half to another building to eat our meals, and we got 2 meals a day. So we usually ate, sometime during the morning. We got a lot of food. It was kind of like a cafeteria system. And then we ate again about 4:30. But you had to walk, and it was downtown. And sometimes there was crime going on. This was back in the days of war protests. There was one protest that went on that had SWAT cars all around our block waiting for protesters to act up. I don't think anything actually happened. There were some drive-by shootings. and it was all pavement. I had come from Grayling to Wayne, and it was a culture shock. I also wasn't academically prepared. I went into an honors program from high school based on my grades, and I looked at the people in it, and they were they were strange people with very unstructured classes. It was learn on your own. And after 2 or 3 weeks, I said, this is wrong. I have to get out of these honors classes and take regular classes. I did that. And one of my classes was English, and it turned out I had no idea how to write a paper or read a book. And my teacher had to teach me. I also took ancient Chinese civilization and astronomy. Terrible, terrible classes. And I went to each of my 3 teachers, the classes only lasted 12 weeks, and said, I'm in trouble. I don't know what I'm doing. And my English teacher helped me. Didn't like me, but he helped me. And because I had gone for help so many times, I ended up with 4 in all my classes. And I had mono because I didn't sleep. I read every assignment at least 3 times. And I really hated it. So I stayed home for 3 months getting over mono, and then I went back, and then I went for another year, and then I decided to switch to Central, where I would have grass instead of just sidewalks. And I had really good grades once I got going at Wayne. So going to Central was much easier. I majored in elementary education, and I'm trying to remember how it happened. But I got married to Jack Jones in April of 1968. Was it 68? Yes. And because I had transferred, I wasn't quite done with my college. I had 1 more term to go. But this was during Vietnam, and Jack was stationed at Fort Sill in Oklahoma, Lawton, Oklahoma. So I went in June to Lawton, Oklahoma. Didn't finish my degree at the time. And I lived in Lawton through that next year until he was almost ready to get out. He had had pneumonia coming out of basic training. He had been in the hospital for 2 or 3 months. During that time, he came home and we got married. He went back. I went back in the hospital. And they made him a legal clerk because he was one of the few intelligent, capable persons that they had to choose from. They were drafting everybody at the time, and a lot of these people couldn't have done the job. So each time his name came up for advanced training, which it took, you had to get through this 8 weeks before you could go to Vietnam, it got delayed. I think that perhaps they kept requesting that it be delayed, and since you had only been drafted for 2 years, after you got through the 12 months, you wouldn't have been able to go to Vietnam so we could start breathing again. We didn't want him to go to Vietnam. The weather in Lawton was terrible. It was awful, and we were poor. And I cried every time he brought his paycheck home because it just wasn't going to make it. But we ate hamburger for 29 cents a pound from the base and went to the movies for 50 cents. And we had no air conditioning. The second year, we bought an air conditioner on like rent to own, and we put it in one room and pretty much lived in that room. We put an ironing board up and ate on the ironing board. What else do we need? When we came back, I finished my degree and did my student teaching in Midland. And after that, we moved to Lansing. I got a job at Perry School District as a first grade teacher, and Jack worked doing different things. For a while, he was a driver for somebody, and then he was a driver for something called, I don't know, it's 3 letters. I think it's REO. It was like a UPS, only it was a small company. And then he worked at a grocery warehouse eventually. We moved to an apartment building, and he was the apartment manager, and he was working at Associated Grocers in Holt. And that's when Heather was born. And shortly after that, we bought a house in East Lansing where Jack still lives, 1166 Lilac. And then Chris was born. So Heather was born in 1975 and Chris in 1978. Jack and I were married for 23 years, and then we were divorced. And then I was single for another long time, 23 years maybe. And I remarried in 2010 to Charles McLeod. When I actually had a boyfriend while I was at Wayne. But then that ended. Can't remember. I finally did get my job as a car hop at Curly's Drive-In. And amazingly today, Curly is one of my friends on Facebook. He's quite old and still lives in Grayling and remembers me. And we both remember an accident that happened when a girl in the drive-in who worked there had an accident slicing onions and cut the end of her finger off. So they rushed her to the emergency room, and then they came back to look through the garbage for the end of her finger. They were able to reattach it. Thank heavens for Curly. But at that time, I got to know people in town more, and I was no longer a Baptist, so I actually went to parties on weekends from college. And there was a group of friends that were really good friends. And Chris Kroll was one of them, and he was living in a cabin, I can't remember the name of the canoe livery, right there in Grayling. Cabins are still there, on the river, and he would have parties there. And that's where I met Jack. I mean, I knew who he was. Jack and his sister Jill. I was, at all the school functions, so they graduated together, Jack and Jill Jones. That's about all and actually, one time a hypnotist came to town, and Jack was one of the people that he hypnotized. I do remember that, and it seems like he had to sing an Elvis Presley song. But when I met Jack, he had had a problem. He had had mono and jaundice and was in the hospital, and something, probably a drug they gave him, caused bilateral Bell's palsy, which pretty much means both sides of his face were paralyzed. So when I met him, he was pretty much unable to talk and was drinking beer through a straw. Didn't make too much difference since he doesn't talk too much anyway. But that's when we started dating. After that, I don't remember how this all went. Don't know when I saw him since we were in different towns. But the summers were long and we were both probably up there. I don't remember what he was doing for a living at the time. But he ended up working at Motor Wheel before we got married. Motor Wheel in Lansing. Oh yeah, and then he was drafted from there. We moved into the house on Lilac in 1976, probably. we pretty much immediately got a Cocker Spaniel. The dog was fine actually as a puppy, but crazy dog, difficult dog. Um, I was working, teaching, and I was able, like, Chris was born in August of 1978, and I was able to take that next year off and then go back to my job. When Chris was born, he had he developed a heart condition called paroxysmal atrial tachycardia, which is when instead of a normal heart rate for an infant, which is rapid, it was twice as fast. And if you're an adult and that happens, if you don't come out of it, they just give you a shock and you come out of it. But for an infant, they didn't need to do that. He was pretty healthy other than that and didn't want to, so they gave him a lot of medication. It was a very difficult time trying to keep up with the medical requirements and the changes, because infants change a lot. He had to go back in the hospital when he was 3 weeks old or a month old for another week. And Heather, sweet little Heather, I had come home to visit, and Chris was in this second hospital. And she said, "Don't take him back. I like him." So we decided we ought to save Chris and bring him back home. But we lived in the Flower Pot neighborhood. This means all the streets were named after flowers. And it was an old East Lansing neighborhood. It had a school, Red Cedar, which also drew from University Village and Cherry Lane apartments. There were international kids. The American kids who lived in the neighborhood were definitely the minority. There were more international kids at this school, or kids from other states, because their parents were living in married housing. For instance, when Heather went to kindergarten, she had a crush on a boy, and I can't remember his name. But at the end of the school year, he moved home to New Zealand. And this is the way the kids learned friendships. They were pretty used to gaining and losing friends and having friends who came from different cultures. Heather spent a lot of time with Korean friends and learned to like Korean food a lot. It was a very fascinating school. Nobody had a lot of money, but all of these people were well educated. There were people in the neighborhood, and there still are, who could certainly afford to live somewhere else, but enjoy that little neighborhood atmosphere. Family dynamics. After Chris was born and my year was up, I remember I needed to go back to school to set up my classroom. And Chris, of course, got sick with, a virus, a high fever. This was in maybe the end of August, first part of September, just before school started. And I took him with me to try to set up this classroom. So I had him on a backpack. I thought, what am I doing? My mother at the time had a houseboat in Bimini in the Bahamas. My father had died, and my mother was finally, at the end of her life, able to enjoy herself a little, and she spent her winters down on her houseboat. However, this was hurricane season, and that weekend, a hurricane came through. We lost communication with Bimini, and nobody really knew communication wasn't like it is today. We really didn't know how bad it had been on the island. Her houseboat was on South Bimini where nobody else lived. And I didn't know, but her friends had insisted that she leave the houseboat and come and stay in North Bimini. We tried calling down there and nobody was answering the phone. I was calling the Red Weather Service. Finally got through to somebody who answered the phone and said, "Dead. They're all dead." And I thought, after I hung up, they must have been talking about the phone lines and they just couldn't hear me. Couldn't be that the people were dead and all dead. And they weren't. They had weathered the storm okay. That same weekend, my niece Julie was supposed to be getting married, or getting ready to get married, up in Petoskey. Her fiancé had been hit in the head on a sailboat and was in the hospital with a concussion. 3 things happened, and I decided this was a sign that I should actually do what was more important in life. And I did not want to go back to work. So I went into school the first day of classes, had my classroom there. My principal came to visit, and I said, "You got to get me out of here. I don't want to teach this year." And he had people he had had to pink slip, so that was okay with him. He had somebody who could fill in. That is an economic blow when you give up your career. You never catch up. Even now, receiving Social Security, that hurts. When you didn't work for a while, it hurts. So I became a stay-at-home daycare provider for children. I then stopped doing that and I had a typing service where I typed for students. Then I got a job at a printing shop up the streets, not too far from there. And then got a job working for the state of Michigan. Started out as a temporary secretary and ended up, after having worked, I don't know how many years, less than 20, but quite a few years as a manager. Working for the state offered great benefits and a decent salary and a lot of stability, so that was good. And it also adds to your Social Security. But if anybody's listening, you got to think ahead. Because people who made much less money when they worked, but worked steadily, are receiving a lot more at this point. But we have a pension, and that's good. Our kids, Red Cedar, once we got to the middle school and the high school, Red Cedar was considered sort of the wrong side of the tracks. And they kind of had to battle the neighborhoods that thought they were better than we were. That is still going on to this day, and they're planning on closing the elementary school in that neighborhood because it seems to be more expendable than the ones in their neighborhood. So that's happening this year. My father had died before I had children. And my mother worked at the motel for a while longer and then eventually retired. She eventually did give up her houseboat and live in East Lansing. Jack's family, his father lived longer, but his mother died relatively early of breast cancer. My father died of a stroke, but he also had cancer of the bronchial tubes at the time. But it turned out that it probably was, after they did an autopsy, that it wasn't actually growing much. Maybe this is a good time to interject that health. My father, and the men in my father's family, his brothers, and then their kids, once they retired, did not do well. This was the kind of thing where, as young people, they had a good time. They partied even through Prohibition, and then they worked, and then they retired, and they didn't seem to be able to find themselves as far as having a purpose in life, and they mostly became alcoholics. My father, when living in Grayling, after he had finally retired when I was 12, I was in either in college or had already gotten married. The alcoholism got to the point where he really wasn't functioning. There wasn't anything you could do at that time. It was a different time. So my mother had him sent to Traverse City State Mental Hospital. The idea really was to detox and get better. But what happened there, and my sister was always angry, what happened there was that they medicated him, and he became a standard mental patient, shuffling, not knowing who people were. And I think maybe the moral of this story is you have to be careful. Certain people can't tolerate certain medications. My sister could never tolerate many medications. She was angry that he was in a state mental hospital, and she went up and talked to his doctors. They had just gotten a new director of his area who believed the patients were over-medicated. He agreed with her and weaned him off his medications, and amazingly, he was fine. They had said he was in early dementia from old age. It wasn't true. Once he was off his medications, he was not unbalanced. He went to like a nursing home, to like a rehab center, to get even better. At that time, he was diagnosed with cancer. He also got very depressed then, came home, and was miserable, thinking he was going to die any minute, but then died of a stroke. Be careful with medications and don't give up too soon, because maybe that's what brought the stroke on. He was only 70, I think he was 73, 72 or 73. So anyway, what I was saying is that we didn't have a very big family when it came to our own children and having family holidays. Sometimes we went to Jack's family to spend the holiday. We would go to his sister's house. He had a twin and he had an older sister. And sometimes they would come to our house. I remember the first time his family came to our house for, I think it was Christmas, might have been Thanksgiving, but it was a turkey. I cooked the turkey, and I wasn't that bad a cook, but turkeys are different. It was huge. You get up at the crack of dawn, put this heavy thing in the oven, and I finally realized it was upside down. Turkeys take about an hour and a half, 2 hours longer when they're upside down, so we all sat around and waited while the turkey cooked, and I was very embarrassed. It tasted all right, though. We had turkey for Thanksgiving, and we had the same thing for Christmas, and then we had Easter egg hunts. We have pictures of our kids opening presents, lots of opening presents. And we have great pictures of Chris wandering around with this little bucket looking for Easter eggs, which he couldn't find, but Heather found most of them. Or the dog helped by finding this vinegar on the eggs. It's amazing how many times I say, I cannot believe that my son, who didn't really know my brother, is just like him. Not just, but a lot like him. It does make you wonder how much runs in families. My brother, worked hard at Ford for a long time. It looked like he was really cheap. He just wouldn't buy anything. He had old cars, and he had one of those push lawnmowers that just has a blade on it, and everybody else had newer things. He just kept saving his money. And then he bought a different house in Farmington Hills, and he started getting Lincolns from his car company with the company discount. He was in finance like he was in charge of finance for the construction of the Rouge River plant. And he could have done more, but he didn't want to ever take an overseas assignment. So he really stopped progressing it at a certain point through his own choice. He was very well read. It didn't matter what I did. If I told him something like I was working for the Department of Community Health, he told me all about my director, just out of the blue. How would one person know that many facts? I don't know. But that's how my son is very much like my brother was. I think both my brother and his daughter Lindsay read. He read and she reads a lot. So I think that's probably a lot of it. My brother, being a male in our family, my father's side of the family, it was mostly the males who are alcoholics. In my mother's side of the family, I don't know about the males, but I know that there were at least 2 females who were alcoholics. My mother and her sister who lived in Florida. My brother, things were different in those days, and people didn't talk about it. If they thought somebody might have a drinking problem, they didn't necessarily say anything to anyone about it, including the immediate family. So he ended up in trouble with his alcohol once, which involved, esophageal varices, when the digestive system just begins to bleed. They didn't really think he was going to make it, but he did make it through that episode, and he went to rehab, and he stayed sober for about a year, and then had a little bit to drink. It wasn't totally healthy, and ended up having the same problem again, and that time he did die, and he died of alcoholism. His wife was somewhat surprised, didn't know that he had this big a problem, and his daughter didn't know. But my sister and I were familiar enough with this syndrome to be able to tell the doctors, yes, he's drinking all the time. I have cousins, my father's siblings' children, who have died of alcoholism. It's just some families, I think, have a genetic thing, and they also have a way of coping with things. And for the most part, I do think a lot of it has to do with mood and depression, and people are self-medicating. My father was not an angry drunk. He just got quiet and went to bed. Frequently, we would have dinner, and he would then leave the dinner table and go to bed because that was the end. He was too drunk to be up for the evening. But he didn't really bother anyone. He was quite nice until about noon. He was a kindly person for the most part. My sister did not drink. She was married twice and had a child, Julie, who is only 7 years younger than I am. And then she had two children, Anne and John, with her second husband, George. And they lived in Detroit and in Petoskey for the most part. Pat had started having cancer when she got a cancer on her eyelid. And she had to have radiation treatment aimed at her eyelid. This kind of freaked her out. It was followed by a primary breast cancer, and she had treatment for that. And then not too long later, she had another primary, different kind of breast cancer in her other breast. And then it appeared that at the end she had primary lung cancer, either due to the fact that she smoked, or they said more likely due to the fact that she'd had radiation twice in her chest, and ended up dying at home, and I do not remember what year, but it was after having fought cancer for more than 10 years. And they developed amazing ways of dealing with an illness like that and of living with cancer. You have to keep a sense of humor, and she did that really till the end. Again, she was smart. She was kind of mad that she never got to finish college, although she could have later if she'd really wanted to. She worked all of her life pretty much, and ended up, her last job was working at the state as a, I don't know what you call it. They actually typed the Medicaid manuals, which was an ongoing job for about 10 people. So that's what she did at the end, and retired from the state. She enjoyed having pets. They always had lots of pets around their house, dogs, cats, and assorted things. She enjoyed traveling too. I've never taken as many vacations as I would have liked to. When the kids were little, we went, before actually, when Heather was born and Chris hadn't been born yet, Jack and I took a trip with Heather, a trip with our dog to Pennsylvania Amish country, and we camped. We stayed in a campground there and woke up to the sound of horses walking by, and that was really a lot of fun. The kids and I and Jack and I we won a trip to Florida. And I put my name in a box at the Meridian Mall, and we won about half the trip. You had to add people and add days. And we went to Disney World at that time. Chris didn't remember a thing because he was an infant, and Heather really enjoyed it. Later, I took Chris and Heather all the way to Florida in a little Toyota Tercel, and Chris had pneumonia. He just didn't have any luck on those trips. But we went to Disneyland World anyway, and had a good time. Heather and I did anyway. When I was in college, my girlfriend and I, was supposed to be 4 or 5 people, but it turned out to be Alice Dykeman and I went to Europe and went to 5 countries. We flew from country to country, spent 3 weeks. I always said I'd come back soon, and I've never been back to Europe. But we're planning a trip to Scotland with Heather and Chris this year. Well, when Alice and I went to Europe, my sister, who was a travel agent for a while, she worked for Swiss Air, tried to teach us a little about how to get around over there, especially 2 young women. It was back at the time that young women in Europe, you didn't wear pants or slacks. You were supposed to wear skirts most of the time. And You had to behave a certain way. She said if you show up at a hotel and they don't have a room for you, and you know you've reserved a room, you tell them you're going to sit down and wait until they find a room for you. And we had to do that in Germany. I think it was Germany. I'm sorry, we have no record of your reservation. We said, could you find us a room? Because we're going to wait right here. So those crazy American girls sat there, and pretty soon they had a room for us. They were just trying to get more money. And we never could figure out how to use the bathrooms in Europe. We were uncomfortable a lot because we just looked and laughed. Didn't know what to do in those bathrooms. We were in a French restaurant. We could not believe how long you have to sit there and wait for the courses. Apparently they plan on spending many hours in their restaurants. We were almost the only people in this restaurant, and we ordered steak tartare, not quite knowing what we were going to get, and it looked just like a pile of warm, raw hamburger. I understand it's spiced, but we wouldn't know because we didn't try it. We were just hungry and waited for our check so we could get out of there. We also stopped in Spain at a place that Hemingway went to, but Hemingway seems to have gone to many places in the world. And this was a place that was famous for roast pig. What do you call it? Suckling pig. It was good. Well, it depends, you learn things from your parents. My father didn't think men were the best thing in the world for women. It's like, no, none of them are good enough for you. He also wanted me to be independent so that I could live by myself if I had to. And I should become a teacher or a secretary. And as it turns out, I've been both, and both of them have certainly served to put food on the table at times. My mother didn't have to, I don't remember her telling me things, but my mother and probably her family came from independent women. My mother obviously in agreeing to run businesses in Grayling alone and manage them along with a child to raise must have been fearless. I found an article about when my mother retired and left Grayling. They threw a party for her and talked about all of her accomplishments, and I had forgotten how many things she had done. She was Grayling's first female city councilwoman. She was a member of the Republican Party back in the Eisenhower days. She chaired various organizations, and she did a lot of work. She got to, what was it? When Grayling celebrated its 100th year, I think it was 100th, they had a big parade. She was out there wearing her, looked like, Little House on the Prairie type dress with the bonnets, and riding in an important car, one of those limousines. So she did a lot and didn't have a whole lot of fun because she was working so long. And then when she retired from working in a business, she bought a houseboat in Bimini and went down there and enjoyed herself at least 6 months out of the year, and came up and stayed with us the other 6 months after she had actually sold the motel. It's led to her raising very independent daughters who are now raising more independent daughters. This is not a family where we sit home and cook, I guess. Randy was a friend of my mother's. He came to visit us in Grayling. He came to visit us in Lansing. He was originally from Belize, and he was a ship's mechanic. When I say ship, we're talking small boat, a boat mechanic. Many of these charter boats actually had mechanics on board to make sure the customers got where they were going. And he was kind of my mother's boyfriend, I guess. But Randy was married, had a wife in Miami. He actually delivered her Avon orders for her, and she didn't particularly care what he was doing or whether he had a girlfriend. That was not an issue. This was a different culture. And so Randy was a friend to my mother. The family, my sister and brother and I, all sort of thought he was after some money he thought my mother had. Another one of those impressions that American women have money. And he actually called me after she died. I think he thought maybe she had left him money, but that was not true. She had, for some reason, gotten angry at him before she died and had not really had anything to do with him. I think it had to do with drugs. There was a lot of marijuana running through Bimini, and I'm sure he had something to do with it, and probably involved her and her houseboat, and she wasn't happy about that. Yes, she knew the Hemingways. She knew. Well, let me think. They lived in Miami, but they had a place, I think. Trying to remember how. Ernest Hemingway's brother, what's his name? His brother, who was also an artist, also a writer. And it was either, I'm not sure he was the father of Mariel and Margot, or if it was another brother. I do know that this Ernest's brother's wife's name was Mouse, and she was actually my mother's friend more than the man was. But they did my mother enjoyed having parties and going to parties and meeting people and having a good time. And we have to remember she was about 75 to 80 years old at the time. I cannot think of what you did that amazed me. Any more than children are always amazing. Advice as a parent, I'll tell you, as a grandparent, even more, the only thing I can say is enjoy them while they're young. It lasts such a brief time. They are so sweet. And later, they just have bigger problems and bigger issues and more things going on. Just enjoy them when they just love everything. Even little Allison now is growing up.
What would you want people to remember or think of you?
It's hard to say what you want somebody to remember about you. Everybody feels like they failed in a lot of ways. How about it? I did the best I could. It would be nice if people thought I was a nice person. And that used to be true. But not everyone's nice all the time. I'd like them to think of me as a nice person. Giving. A giving person.